The courthouse steps were already crowded when the patrol car rolled to a stop, lights flashing without sirens, a quiet show of authority meant to command attention without explanation. People slowed, phones paused mid-scroll, conversations dipped into silence. At the base of the stairs stood a black woman in a charcoal coat, structured and simple, her posture upright, her face composed. A leather briefcase rested at her side. She had arrived early, as she always did, and now she waited, patient, unhurried, watching the building that carried her name on official letterhead she never flaunted. The officer stepped out with practiced confidence. His uniform was pressed, his tone already rehearsed. He called out to her as if she were out of place, as if the stone columns behind her were not familiar territory. She turned slowly, offering him her full attention, calm and respectful. He asked for identification. She reached into her coat and handed him a badge, worn but polished, the seal unmistakable to anyone who had taken the time to learn it. He barely looked. His eyes flicked down and back up, dismissive, amused. A smirk crept across his face. He laughed once, sharp and short, loud enough for nearby ears. He said it was fake. He said people tried this all the time. He said impersonation was a crime, and that she was making his morning difficult. Around them, the air tightened. A few bystanders stopped completely. Someone lifted a phone. The woman did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply said her name and asked him to read the badge again. The officer waved it off, holding it between two fingers like evidence already condemned. He told her to put her hands where he could see them. He told her to step away from the entrance. She complied, moving exactly as instructed. Her dignity remained intact, even as the imbalance of power pressed down. The officer's voice grew louder, each word edged with certainty. He repeated that the badge was fake. He repeated that she was trespassing. He repeated that respect was earned, not claimed. The courthouse doors opened and closed behind them, officials passing through without stopping, assuming the scene was routine. The woman stood still, eyes forward, absorbing the humiliation with controlled breath. She knew this moment well, not personally, but institutionally. She had read it in transcripts, seen it in footage, felt it echo through cases that crossed her desk. Today, it was unfolding in front of her. The officer demanded she kneel while he verified her identity. The word landed heavy. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Phones rose higher. For a fraction of a second, the woman hesitated, not out of fear, but out of principle. Then she lowered herself, slowly, deliberately, onto the cold stone. Her coat brushed the ground. Her briefcase rested beside her, untouched. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. The officer radioed in, his tone casual, confident he was in control. He joked about fake badges and bold liars. The woman remained still, her expression unreadable, her spine straight even on her knees. She did not plead. She did not protest. She waited. Above them, carved into the courthouse facade, the words honoring justice caught the morning light. Below, the contradiction played out in real time. No one intervened. No one corrected the officer. The imbalance held, fragile and tense, suspended in front of witnesses who sensed that something was wrong but did not yet know why. The woman lifted her gaze once, briefly, toward the building she had sworn to uphold. Her eyes held no anger, only resolve. Whatever came next, she understood, would not be decided by volume or force. It would be decided by the truth, revealed in its own time, using the very rules now being misused against her. The crowd felt it then, a subtle shift, an unspoken sense that this scene was larger than it appeared. The officer checked his watch, impatient. Somewhere inside the building, schedules waited, hearings prepared, and a courtroom stood ready. Outside, history paused, balanced on a moment of unchecked authority. None of them realized how quickly the balance was about to turn. Forever changed. The officer paced in a small arc, boots scraping against stone, his radio crackling with half-listened replies. He spoke into it again, repeating her name with a tone that suggested inconvenience rather than concern. Dispatch asked for confirmation. He rolled his eyes, glancing toward the growing crowd, aware of the phones but unconcerned by them. To him, they were background noise, spectators without authority. The woman remained on her knees, hands visible, back straight. Time stretched. People whispered. A man in a suit slowed his walk, recognizing her face but not yet placing it. A clerk hesitated near the door, torn between duty and discomfort, then retreated inside. The courthouse continued its rhythm, indifferent on the surface, while tension pooled outside its steps. The officer returned to her, crouching slightly so he could speak low, his voice meant only for her. He told her she should have thought this through. He told her that pretending to be powerful never ended well. He told her that if she apologized now, he might let it go. His words were measured, confident that the outcome rested entirely in his hands. She looked at him steadily. She said nothing. Her silence unsettled him more than any protest could have. He straightened, raising his voice again, narrating his actions for the benefit of the crowd. He announced that he was detaining her pending verification. He repeated that the badge was fake. Each repetition hardened his position, making retreat more difficult. A second patrol car arrived, then a third. The presence multiplied the authority, reinforcing the assumption that the first officer must be right. Colleagues nodded, trusting the judgment already made. None of them examined the badge closely. None of them asked why a woman who carried herself with such composure would risk such a public deception. Momentum took over, carrying them forward. The crowd thickened. Phones recorded from multiple angles. Someone whispered her name aloud, uncertain, testing it against memory. Another person searched quietly on their phone. The officer noticed the murmurs and bristled. He warned the crowd to keep their distance. He reminded them that interfering could result in arrest. The warning worked. They stepped back, but they kept filming. The woman shifted slightly to ease the pressure on her knees. The officer snapped at her to stay still. His impatience showed now, a crack in the calm authority he projected. Dispatch had not yet confirmed anything, and the delay irritated him. He filled the silence with assumptions, speaking about people who thought they were above the law. Each word dug him deeper. Inside the building, a courtroom clerk checked the docket and frowned. A case scheduled to begin soon listed her name as presiding judge. The clerk assumed a delay, perhaps traffic, perhaps an emergency. She picked up the phone, intending to call Chambers. The line rang unanswered. Outside, the scene continued to tighten. The second officer approached the woman, curiosity edging his caution. He asked quietly where she worked. She answered simply, giving the courthouse address. He glanced toward the building, then back at her, uncertainty flickering. The first officer cut in, asserting control, telling his colleague not to indulge the act. The moment passed, but the doubt lingered. A supervisor arrived, drawn by the cluster of vehicles and cameras. He assessed the situation quickly, relying on the summary given by his subordinate. Fake badge. Non-compliant subject. Public disturbance. The supervisor nodded, accepting the narrative without challenge. He addressed the woman, asking once more for identification. She repeated that the badge was legitimate and asked him to read the inscription carefully. He did not. He instructed the officer to proceed. The escalation formalized. What had begun as a single judgment now became institutional. The woman felt the weight of it, the way systems closed ranks to protect their own decisions. Still, she remained calm. Her patience was not passive. It was strategic, anchored in an understanding of process and consequence. The crowd sensed the shift as well. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was an assertion of power being defended in real time. The phones did not lower. The recording continued, steady and unblinking. Somewhere, the footage would travel beyond these steps, but for now, the moment belonged to those present. The officer finally received a response from dispatch, incomplete and cautious. The name matched a record, but details were pending. He scoffed, dismissing it as coincidence. He announced that names could be stolen. He signaled to place her in handcuffs once verification was complete. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. The woman closed her eyes briefly, then opened them, gaze fixed forward. She understood that escalation was necessary for what came next. The system had to reveal itself fully before it could be held to account. Around her, the courthouse loomed, silent witness to a confrontation that was no longer just about a badge, but about the fragile line between authority and abuse, now stretched to its limit. The supervisor gave a subtle nod, and with it, permission. The first officer reached for his cuffs, metal glinting in the morning light. He narrated the motion aloud, explaining procedure as if teaching a class, his voice steady, authoritative. He said this was standard. He said refusal would escalate matters. He said compliance was in her best interest. Each sentence was less about her and more about reassuring himself and those watching that everything unfolding was justified. The woman did not resist. She shifted her wrists behind her back as instructed, careful and precise. The cuffs closed with a sharp click that echoed against the stone steps. A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Phones zoomed in. The officer adjusted the cuffs, tighter than necessary, then stepped back, satisfied. He announced that she was being detained for impersonation and obstruction. The words were formal, rehearsed, and wrong. He ordered her to stand. When she rose, slowly, the imbalance was stark. 3 officers surrounded her now, a perimeter of uniforms and equipment. She stood shorter than them, unarmed, composed. The supervisor addressed the crowd, warning them again about interference. He pointed to the cameras and said recordings would be seized if they crossed the line. It was a bluff, but an effective one. The crowd stayed put, anger simmering just below the surface. The officer demanded additional identification. She told him her purse was in her briefcase. He opened it without asking, rifling through papers with casual disrespect. Legal documents slid against each other, tabs and signatures visible. He did not read them. He was searching for confirmation of his belief, not the truth. When he found a business card embossed with a seal, he laughed, holding it up as proof of deception. He said anyone could print these. He placed the card back carelessly, bending the corner. The woman watched, jaw set, but said nothing. Her restraint was deliberate. Every action was being recorded. Every misstep would matter later. The officer continued, announcing that she would be transported for further questioning. He gestured toward the patrol car. The supervisor approved, already turning away, confident the situation was under control. A courthouse security officer stepped outside then, drawn by the commotion. He paused, recognition flickering across his face as he took in the scene. He hesitated, uncertain whether to intervene. The first officer caught his glance and fixed him with a stare that brooked no challenge. Authority asserted itself horizontally, silencing doubt before it could speak. The security officer retreated, shaken. The woman was guided down the steps, one hand on her arm, firm enough to signal dominance. The officer spoke quietly to her again, telling her this could have gone differently. He said pride was a dangerous thing. He said people like her often learned lessons the hard way. His words were not cruel in volume, but they were heavy with assumption. She met his gaze briefly, then looked away, refusing to validate the performance. As they reached the patrol car, a voice from the crowd called out her name, louder this time, more certain. The officer ignored it. Another voice repeated it. A murmur spread. Someone said the word judge, questioning, incredulous. The supervisor snapped his head around, irritation flashing across his face. He ordered the crowd to disperse. The command lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. The officer opened the back door of the car. He instructed her to sit. She complied, carefully maneuvering despite the cuffs. The door remained open as he adjusted his radio. Dispatch crackled again, this time with a firmer tone. Verification was still pending, they said. The officer responded with impatience, insisting on urgency. He framed the delay as an inconvenience caused by her actions. Inside the car, the woman sat upright, eyes forward. The interior smelled of plastic and disinfectant. She listened as the officers spoke outside, their voices low but audible. They discussed paperwork, charges, optics. One of them mentioned the cameras. Another dismissed them, saying the footage would show compliance and procedure. None of them questioned the premise. The supervisor stepped aside to take a call. His expression shifted as he listened, brows drawing together. He glanced toward the patrol car, then back toward the courthouse doors. He asked a question, then another, his tone changing, losing its edge. The officer noticed and frowned. He asked what was going on. The supervisor waved him off, still listening. A courthouse administrator emerged, moving quickly now, phone in hand. She scanned the scene, eyes widening as they landed on the woman in the back of the car. She stopped abruptly, disbelief freezing her in place. For a moment, she simply stared. Then she started forward, urgency breaking through protocol. The officer stepped into her path, blocking her approach. He demanded identification. She snapped it open without hesitation, voice tight as she stated her role. She pointed toward the car, saying the woman inside was scheduled to preside over court in minutes. The officer scoffed reflexively, but the words landed differently now, cutting through the narrative he had built. The supervisor ended his call and approached. The administrator repeated herself, louder this time. The supervisor's face drained of color. He asked for the woman's name again. The administrator said it clearly, unmistakably. Silence fell, thick and heavy. The crowd leaned in. Phones steadied. The officer laughed once, uncertain. He said there must be a mistake. The administrator shook her head, eyes never leaving the patrol car. She said there was no mistake. She said the courtroom was waiting. The words settled over the scene like a verdict, exposing the misuse of authority that had carried them here. The officer looked toward the car for the first time without arrogance. Through the open door, the woman met his eyes, calm, composed, unchanged. The rules he had wielded so confidently now turned inward, illuminating every shortcut, every assumption, every ignored detail. Authority had been exercised, but not examined. And now, with witnesses watching and records already forming, its misuse stood undeniable, suspended in the air, waiting for the moment it would collapse under its own weight. The supervisor moved first, not with authority but with caution, every step measured as if the ground had shifted beneath him. He approached the open door of the patrol car and asked the woman, quietly now, to confirm her identity. She did not raise her voice. She stated her full name, clearly, followed by the title she carried by law. Honorable Judge. The words were simple, unembellished, delivered without triumph. They did not need emphasis. Their weight did the work. The officer stiffened. His hand remained on the car door, knuckles whitening. He searched her face for signs of mockery, for arrogance, for anything that would allow him to dismiss what he had just heard. There was nothing. Only calm certainty. The administrator stepped closer, holding up her phone, the court docket visible on the screen. The judge's name sat at the top, highlighted by time and case number. The courtroom was full. The delay was already being noticed. The supervisor swallowed. He asked dispatch to confirm immediately, his tone stripped of impatience. The reply came faster this time, unmistakable. Record verified. Active presiding judge. Courthouse assignment confirmed. The words crackled over the radio, loud enough for the officers nearby to hear. Silence followed, thick and absolute. The crowd leaned in as one, sensing the turn. The officer stepped back from the car as if burned. His earlier confidence collapsed inward, replaced by disbelief. He muttered that he had followed procedure. He said the badge had looked wrong. He said anyone could claim anything. No one responded. Procedure, now illuminated, looked less like protection and more like excuse. The supervisor ordered the cuffs removed. The command was quiet but urgent. The officer hesitated for half a second too long, then reached in, hands trembling as he unlocked them. The metal fell away. The judge brought her hands forward, flexing her wrists once, then resting them in her lap. She stepped out of the car unassisted, straightening her coat, reclaiming her space without a word. The administrator apologized, voice tight with embarrassment and anger. The judge acknowledged her with a small nod. She turned then, finally addressing the officers. Her gaze moved from one to the next, not accusatory, simply observant. She said nothing about humiliation. Nothing about pain. She asked only one question, calm and precise, asking each of them to state their name and badge number for the record. Phones surged higher. The officer froze. The supervisor complied immediately, reciting his information. One by one, the others followed. The first officer spoke last, his voice barely audible. Each name entered the public record, captured from multiple angles, impossible to retract. Authority, once one-directional, now flowed the other way, quiet and absolute. The judge turned toward the courthouse. The administrator hurried ahead, clearing a path through the stunned crowd. As she ascended the steps, people parted instinctively. Some lowered their phones. Others kept recording, aware they were witnessing something rare, power correcting itself without spectacle. At the top of the stairs, the judge paused and looked back. She addressed the supervisor, her voice carrying easily. She informed him that court would proceed as scheduled. She also informed him that a full report would be required before the end of the day, including footage, dispatch logs, and written statements. Her tone was procedural, not punitive. The consequences were implied, not threatened. Inside, the courtroom doors opened. The room rose as she entered, unaware of the full story but sensing its gravity. Outside, the officers remained frozen on the steps, surrounded by witnesses and evidence. The badge that had been dismissed now shone with undeniable clarity. The authority they had misused stood exposed, reversed by nothing more than truth, timing, and the rules they believed only they could wield. The consequences did not arrive with sirens or shouted orders. They unfolded quietly, methodically, carried forward by schedules, policies, and the unrelenting permanence of recorded truth. Inside the courthouse, proceedings began with the judge seated where she belonged, composed, professional, her voice steady as she called the room to order. To those present, she was exactly what the title promised: impartial, controlled, authoritative. Nothing in her demeanor revealed the humiliation that had occurred minutes earlier on the steps outside, but outside, time slowed for the officers left standing in the aftermath. The crowd did not disperse as quickly as they had expected. People lingered, whispering, replaying footage, sending clips to contacts who would send them further still. The first officer avoided eye contact, his posture stiff, shoulders drawn inward. The confidence that had animated his movements earlier was gone, replaced by a brittle stillness. He understood, dimly now, that this moment would not remain contained. Within the hour, Internal Affairs was notified. It was automatic, triggered by the involvement of a judge, by the presence of multiple recordings, by the supervisor's own report, already stripped of bravado. Requests went out for body camera footage, dash cam video, radio logs. Nothing could be selectively forgotten. The system demanded completeness, and for once, it would receive it. The supervisor was called into a quiet office upstairs, away from the crowd but not from consequence. He sat across from a deputy chief who did not raise his voice. The questions were simple, precise, relentless. Why was the badge dismissed without inspection? Why was verification delayed? Why was a subject ordered to kneel? Each answer sounded thinner than the last when spoken aloud. Procedure, when examined closely, revealed the gaps where assumption had filled in for judgment. The first officer was relieved of duty before noon. It was framed as administrative leave, standard language meant to sound neutral. He handed over his weapon and radio without protest. The act felt unreal, like a role reversed mid-scene. He had enforced compliance that morning. Now he was the one being instructed, documented, escorted. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself it would pass. The phones in the lobby suggested otherwise. By midday, the footage had surfaced online. Not edited for drama, not slowed or captioned, just raw angles from different hands, converging on the same truth. A woman kneeling. A badge dismissed. A command given without cause. View counts climbed steadily, comments multiplying beneath them. The story framed itself. No narration was needed. The imbalance spoke clearly enough. Legal analysts began to weigh in, calmly dissecting the actions taken. They spoke about probable cause, about duty to verify, about the risks of humiliation as control. Civil rights attorneys referenced precedent, cases where similar abuses had led to settlements, reforms, careers ended. The conversation shifted from shock to examination. This was not an isolated mistake, they said. It was a pattern made visible. Inside chambers, between hearings, the judge reviewed the preliminary report delivered to her. She read it carefully, noting omissions, language that softened reality. She marked it for revision and returned it without comment. The request was clear. Accuracy mattered. Record mattered. This was not personal. It was institutional. The supervisor submitted his written statement before the end of the day, as ordered. He reread it twice before sending, aware that every word would be scrutinized. He included his own failures alongside those of his subordinate, a decision born less of courage than inevitability. Accountability, once triggered, tended to widen its scope. By evening, the department released a public statement acknowledging the incident and confirming an internal investigation. The language was cautious, measured, but the admission alone was notable. It confirmed authenticity. It confirmed seriousness. It confirmed that this would not be quietly buried. Community leaders responded with calls for transparency, not outrage, their restraint lending credibility to their demands. The first officer watched the coverage from home, uniform folded on a chair nearby. He replayed the moment in his head, searching for a point where he could have stopped, where he could have asked a different question, taken a second look. Each replay ended the same way. He had been certain. Certainty, he now understood, was not protection. Days passed. The investigation deepened. Additional witnesses were interviewed, including the courthouse security officer who had hesitated on the steps. His statement described the pressure he felt to defer, the fear of contradicting police authority. His honesty added another layer, revealing how easily misuse could ripple outward, silencing others. The findings were compiled with methodical care. They concluded that the detention lacked reasonable suspicion, that the demand to kneel was unjustified, that verification procedures were ignored. The language was firm, unmistakable. Policy violations were cited. Training failures acknowledged. Responsibility assigned. Disciplinary actions followed. The first officer was terminated. The supervisor received a lengthy suspension and mandatory retraining. His future advancement effectively ended. The department announced revised protocols for credential verification, mandatory bias training, and new guidelines for public detentions near civic buildings. Reforms, tangible and documented, emerged directly from the incident. The judge did not comment publicly beyond a brief statement emphasizing trust in due process. She did not name names. She did not recount the humiliation. She spoke only of responsibility and reform, of systems correcting themselves when exposed to light. Her restraint amplified the impact more than anger ever could have. In courtrooms and briefing rooms, the footage became instructional material. Officers watched it in silence, seeing how quickly authority could curdle into abuse, how easily confidence could replace caution. The lesson was not delivered by lecture but by example, immutable and uncomfortably clear. The consequences settled into permanence. Records updated. Careers altered. Policies rewritten. The moment on the courthouse steps, once dismissed as routine, now existed as a reference point, cited and remembered. Justice had not arrived with spectacle. It had arrived with documentation, discipline, and reform, measured and enduring, leaving no doubt that authority, when misused, eventually answers to itself. The systemic reform moved quietly but decisively through the department. Training modules were revised to include specific instructions on credential verification, emphasizing that badges and titles could not be dismissed based on assumption or bias. Every officer would now be required to complete additional courses on civil rights, implicit bias, and procedural restraint. The lessons drawn from that morning on the courthouse steps became central to the curriculum. Policy language was clarified to remove ambiguity, explicitly stating that individuals claiming official positions, especially judges, attorneys, and other civic authorities, must be treated with respect and verified carefully before any enforcement action. The department circulated a memorandum reinforcing that kneeling or other physically coercive measures could not be applied without clearly documented legal justification. Supervisors were instructed to review all detentions in real time, with accountability measures for lapses in judgment. Beyond internal procedures, the City Council took notice. Civic leaders requested briefings on the incident, asking how public trust could be restored and maintained. Community advisory panels were formed to evaluate enforcement policies, and recommendations were incorporated into a new oversight framework. Transparency became a priority. Body camera footage, radio logs, and reports of incidents involving the public were made more accessible, allowing independent review when complaints arose. The officers involved were reassigned pending the results of additional oversight, with some permanently removed from frontline duties. Their files now included the official finding of misuse of authority, a record that would follow them indefinitely. The department committed to public accountability, releasing redacted reports that highlighted systemic weaknesses and outlined steps to prevent recurrence. Courthouse staff, inspired by the visible correction of the misused authority, participated in workshops emphasizing civil protections and respectful engagement with law enforcement. Legal clerks, security personnel, and administrators were briefed on how to escalate concerns safely and effectively when encounters with officers appeared inappropriate. A culture of proactive vigilance began to replace passive compliance, ensuring that justice would be upheld even outside the courtroom. Social media, initially the channel for exposure, became a tool for reform as well. Videos documenting improper procedures, when verified, were submitted for training purposes, reinforcing the principle that public oversight mattered. The viral moment that had shocked the community now served as a permanent reference, illustrating both the risks of unchecked power and the possibility of systemic correction. Through these steps, the courthouse and police department gradually rebuilt trust. Citizens began to recognize that when abuses occurred, mechanisms existed to address them. Officers were reminded that authority carried responsibility, that enforcement without accountability was temporary power at best, and lasting respect required transparency and fairness. The morning on the courthouse steps, once a scene of humiliation, now existed in institutional memory as a turning point. Policies were adjusted. Leadership was reminded that reputation depended on conduct. Public confidence, once shaken, began to restore itself not through words alone, but through tangible, lasting reform. The woman returned to her chambers with quiet dignity, her steps measured, her presence commanding but calm. Colleagues greeted her with relief, aware of the ordeal she had endured yet inspired by the composure with which she had handled it. No dramatic gestures, no words of anger, only the assurance that justice, once exposed, moved steadily and inexorably. Outside, the courthouse steps no longer bore the weight of tension. Witnesses shared the recordings, now tempered by understanding, recognizing that what they had seen was a microcosm of broader systemic issues. Conversations turned from outrage to reflection, from spectacle to responsibility. People spoke of fairness, of vigilance, of the need to ensure that authority never again operated unchecked. The judge addressed her staff, not about humiliation, but about principle. She reminded them that integrity often required patience and poise, that power was most effective when wielded responsibly, and that mistakes, even by those sworn to uphold the law, must be met with accountability. not silence. Her message was simple but resonant: respect the rules, uphold dignity, and let the system correct itself when it falters. For the officers involved, the lesson was permanent. Their actions, recorded and scrutinized, followed them beyond that day. Careers were altered, reputations redefined. The first officer learned, belatedly, that authority exercised without examination collapses under truth. The supervisor realized that oversight is not optional, it is the mechanism by which trust is maintained. Every procedural gap they had exploited, or ignored, was now codified as a cautionary example. The public, too, received its own reminder: vigilance matters. Civic engagement, recording, questioning, and insisting on transparency are not acts of defiance, they are protections for justice itself. Social media, once a tool for exposure alone, became a channel for education, for systemic improvement, and for holding power accountable in ways that were measured, verifiable, and constructive. In the end, the courthouse returned to routine, but the lesson endured. The badge that had been doubted, the authority that had been challenged, and the humiliation that had been witnessed, all became part of a story larger than one morning, one officer, or one citizen. It became a story of resilience, of measured accountability, and of the quiet power of truth. And for those who watched, recorded, or shared that moment, the takeaway was unmistakable: justice does not always shout, it does not always act immediately, but when truth is clear, when process is followed, and when authority is held to its own rules, fairness prevails. And in that clarity, dignity is restored.